All right. Hey, Carrie, thank you for joining me today. I'm putting together this video for my clients who are considering divorce or thinking about divorce or curious about divorce. You are a divorce attorney and mediator at at Jacobson Family Law.
My mom. Mhm.
Yes, thank you. And you're in Columbia, is that right?
Yes, I am located in Columbia, but our office is virtual.
Yeah.
So we serve clients all throughout Maryland and the DMV.
Oh, okay, very cool. So not just Maryland, you can do like Virginia, DC, places like that?
So we can for mediation, which is one of the services that we provide. For actual court filings of a divorce, it's only Maryland, but we have colleagues in all jurisdictions that we can refer clients to.
Okay, perfect. And for people who don't know me, I'm Carrie Mead. I'm a licensed therapist, and I also have a virtual office. So this will appeal to my current clients and audience because we're used to not meeting in person. We're all really busy, so I think for a lot of people, this feels like a nice convenience. I'm also licensed in the state of Maryland, and that's where all of my clients are. And that's good to know about mediation. I didn't know that there were different rules there. So you mentioned the mediation is one of your services. Would you be able to just sort of let people know like what other services you provide?
Absolutely. So we work with clients on all out of court resolutions to divorce.
Okay.
So that includes divorce mediation. It includes settlement negotiation. So where we are representing a client or an individual and helping them negotiate the terms of a settlement agreement, either with their spouse directly or with their spouse's attorney.
Mm-hmm.
We also do collaborative divorce, and I'm happy to dive into the specifics about that a little bit later if you have questions, because it's kind of a unique process. Also, in addition to those divorce related services, we work with clients on pre or post-nuptial agreements, as well as estate planning.
Oh, okay. So quite a few things.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. And do people, I mean, it's interesting you brought up pre and post nups because I've seen a lot of people talking about not prenups, but post nups. I mean,
Yes.
I get what pre and post mean, but can you talk to me about like why that might occur like after the fact?
Yes, for a couple of reasons. One, it could simply be that people got so busy in their wedding planning and life, they simply didn't get around to signing their prenup before they got married. So that's one instance. Another instance that we honestly commonly see is that one or both of the spouses start a business after they have gotten into a relationship. It may be that that person is the only one that's really in the business and they want to kind of protect it in some way, and we negotiate a post-nup related to that. A third time that we see it is sometimes when things are not wonderful in the relationship, but they're not necessarily at the place where they are looking to divorce or separate, but they are kind of planning for that contemplation that may come down the road. They may consider doing a postnup. I
Okay.
would say, though, that the biggest difference between like a postnuptial agreement and a traditional separation agreement is your postnup is only going to deal with financial aspects and cannot address custody related issues, whereas a separation agreement is going to address both custody as well as financial issues.
Okay, that's very helpful. And the term separation agreement, that is what you're referring to when the divorce is finalized and these are the terms of the divorce. Is that correct?
Basically. So it's the contract that couples sign that indicate how their assets are going to be divided, how custody is going to be addressed, what the time, the parent time sharing arrangement may be, what child support is going to look like, if there's going to be alimony paid, all of those pieces. It's referred to as many different things. Most people know it as a separation agreement. We also refer to it as a marital settlement agreement. And if people can come to an agreement on those issues, then that does become the basis of their final divorce decree.
Okay, very good. That's very helpful because I know there's a lot of terminology that probably makes sense to you, but don't that we don't necessarily know. So if I hear you use
Absolutely.
anything I don't know, I'll definitely ask you just to define it for
Yes.
us because it's a whole nother language when you're talking with a lawyer and courts. So thank you
Yes,
for that.
absolutely.
So for the format of today, I have some questions that my past and present clients have put out to me, and then I've added some that I've just heard asked enough times in groups and in therapy. So I kind of have them into three categories: like general questions about divorce, financial questions, and then like the kid zone. Um,
Mhm.
so I'm going to start with just some general questions, and we're just going to go back and forth in this sort of Q&A style, and hopefully this will be really helpful for whoever gets to view this. That's curious about how Maryland divorces work. So I guess my first question is there a typical process from marriage to divorce in Maryland? Like how long does it take? What makes it official versus, in separating and all that kind of stuff. So can you talk me through like the normal typical process of that?
Okay, so I will say what's normal and typical for our clients versus what the normal and typical situation may be for those cases that are going through the litigation track.
Okay, yes.
Okay,
Very,
because they are entirely different worlds.
okay, yeah, very good. Yeah, we'll
So
talk about that for sure.
yeah.
Yes.
So for our clients, we are generally working with our clients for 6 months or less in negotiating the terms of their agreement. So
Okay.
all of those issues that are within that separation agreement. So things like spousal support, child support, custody arrangements, property division, those types of things.
Okay.
Also, once they have negotiated those agreements, then finalizing the divorce in court. We call it an uncontested divorce. It's the court filing and the court granting the divorce based on what the parties have agreed to.
Okay.
So most of our clients are done with that whole process from start to finish within 6 months or less.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, and then it's so much easier than the alternative track. So the alternative track, if people are going to litigation because they simply can't come to an agreement on those things or any of those things, maybe they have an agreement on some, but not on others, and they're asking for court involvement or someone else to help make decisions, then unfortunately, most jurisdictions are looking at 1 to 2 years before a judge is finalizing a
Wow.
divorce.
Yeah.
Now, that being said, many, many, many cases do resolve somewhere between that initial filing and a judge making the final decision.
Okay.
It's just that in the court track, you have a lot more hurdles to jump through,
Yeah.
court deadlines, things that they make you go through, and a lot more expense associated with the process.
Yeah, I've heard that mediation is much more affordable than litigation. I'm sure that's and more time efficient. Uh
Absolutely.
are there couples that or families that litigation is or mediation is better or worse for? Like, is there a way for a client who's watching this and going like, I wonder what I should do? Like, is there a way
Mhm.
to discern that or help people decide?
Yeah. So I always say if you can try resolving it outside of court first, that's the ideal. Because if you can, and even if you can reduce the number of issues that need to be resolved in court, then you're going to save an extreme amount of time and extreme amount of money.
Okay.
So if nothing else, you've narrowed the issues down to a handful of things that need to be addressed.
Okay.
For those, there are scenarios where people just can't come to an agreement. They can't see eye to eye for a myriad of reasons. And many times they may start out in litigation and then resolve themselves over time. It could be because of the time, it could be because of the money associated with, that sort of thing. And honestly, the court sets it up for you to have other options in settling. They're going to make people go to mediation. They're going to make people go to settlement conferences and parenting classes because they very much want people to resolve these issues on their own.
Very good. That's super helpful. With that in mind, this question comes up all the time, and I could be wrong, but I think the laws recently changed. People used to have to live separately for a year before they got divorced. Is that still the case? And how do we, and I guess to that also is that the official aspect that starts the separation process?
Okay, this one's a tricky one. So if couples reach an agreement on all of those issues and sign a separation agreement, they do not have to be living separate and apart for the divorce to be granted.
Okay.
So if my spouse and I can agree on everything as how everything's going to happen, we can live in the same house and, contemplate separating in months or years or whatever, and actually file the paperwork for the divorce to be granted. And we have had clients who have chosen to do that. Oftentimes, especially in this housing market, that is something we see more regularly because it is so much more expensive for that second household. So that is one aspect. Maryland is in the process of changing the law. Legislation just recently got passed. It goes into effect in October for those couples who cannot agree on all of those terms and need the court's intervention. The new law will be 6 months separated, but do not have to be living physically separate in different households. They have to be living separately within the household. We'll see how that plays out and how the court determines that.
Yeah. Well, that's really, I think, from my point of view, and I don't know how it feels legally, but for me, it's certainly something that clients have needed. Raising children financially, etc. It precludes a lot of people from taking that step because of the economic impact on having two rents or two mortgages. So this will be, as you said, this will be a watch this space, I guess, to see how that goes. What about like just this idea of, I always say to clients, before you do anything, like call a lawyer, book that initial consultation, pay the couple $100. It's going to be money well spent. How might someone best prepare for that initial consult with their lawyer?
So for anyone who is contemplating divorce, one of the first things that I recommend they do is kind of start gathering documents.
Okay.
It's not that you necessarily need to send the attorney copies of them for the initial consultation, but you should have access to things like, how much do you owe on the mortgage? How much is your house worth? Even if you do like a Zillow or a Redfin estimate. Do each of you does either spouse have retirement assets? What is the approximate, value of those? Are there bank accounts? And how are they titled? How much money does each person earn? Because a lot of this goes into the relief or what you may be asking for in the separation or divorce. And having that information to provide to your attorney will be helpful. And also you're kind of getting ahead of the game, because regardless of what process you end up choosing, you're honestly going to need to have that documentation.
Yeah. And this is really important too, as a PSA, like people, women especially, need to become more involved in these topics. That there are a lot of traditional roles where the husband pays the bills, or maybe the man makes more money and the woman sort of is in la la land about what's going on or not really sure. And that's certainly not the case for everyone, but I certainly run into it. But what you're talking about is like people being informed about like what money's coming in, what's going out, where accounts are held, etc. And I think that is really important. So this may be the first time a woman's really going through the family expenses or figuring out what they have or don't have, which is quite a process, I think, for a lot of women.
Yes. Yeah.
What about like if they decide to use a mediator like you, should they have their own, because I understand you're neutral and you're there for them, should they have their own lawyer helping them with that process?
Yeah. So my answer is I think so. Now, that being said, you want to choose an attorney who is settlement and mediation focused, who is not, cutthroat and litigation focused.
Okay.
And in addition to providing divorce mediation services, we do work with clients individually who may go to mediation. And what we do with those clients is really set them up for knowing what it is they're going to ask for in mediation, what they're entitled to, those places where they may be a bit, have a bit more flexibility in what they're willing to accept or offer. Also, mediation's a great place to find out from the other side, like what their goals and interests are, right? And being creative. And so a good attorney can get that feedback from their client and help them craft an offer that's going to satisfy the needs of the other individual, that also satisfy your interests and goals.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. And could you be someone's mediator and their lawyer, or you would have to be one or the other?
We have to be one or the other. We can't wear both hats.
Okay. I thought so.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify
Yep.
that. Okay.
Yeah. But that being said, there are times where we will represent a client and then suggest that they go to mediation with a colleague, or, that sort of thing. So that that it goes in that process, as opposed to like settlement negotiations or the like. All of that being said, it's not super common that the attorneys are present in the mediations. It happens. I do mediations where attorneys are present. It's not the norm. Usually the mediations occur just with the individuals, and maybe they report back to their attorneys after or in between sessions. They kind of get guidance ahead of time, and ultimately, once the agreement is drafted, the attorney will review it for them.
Okay. And just, is there a typical sense, like, is a mediation session like an hour or two, and that's like 2 or 3 times over the course of the 6 months, or how does that play out?
Yeah. So I can only speak for ourselves, but I would say that the most common traditional mediation sessions are 2 hours. Sometimes we schedule them for 2 hours. They may not take that long. Anything over that, people kind of check out. It's a bit much. We have different packages, so it depends on what the needs of the couples are. I would say our most common package is 3 mediation sessions. Sometimes people need that much, and not every family does. But it's doing the mediation sessions, and then we draft the actual separation agreement. I generally suggest that people have about a week or 2 weeks in between sessions, so that they do have time to consult with their attorney or other professionals. Sometimes there's homework. They need to talk to the mortgage broker, or they need to have an appraisal done. Various things that kind of come up in the process. Okay.
That's super helpful. And are the sessions, and I know this is probably an impossible question to answer, but are they tension filled? Like I imagine I've seen on TV in a courtroom in litigation. Is it like people are crying, or people like level headed, or does that just depend on the couple?
It honestly depends on the couple. And I've worked with couples all across the spectrum. Yeah. There are situations that I have couples sitting next to one another on the sofa, and they've had a lot of the conversations themselves. They've worked out a lot of the details, and they just need guidance from us as to what needs to be included. And also us helping them kind of think through and contemplate the what ifs, right? Those worst case scenarios, so that their document is a durable agreement and holds up. Because people are choosing mediation so that they are not, having to contest these issues in court. What we don't want is an agreement that doesn't stand and it breeds litigation in the future because it's not clear, or that they don't have those backups in place.
Okay, very good. That's super helpful. What about that leads me to sort of my last general question, which is, are there common mistakes that you see people making early on? I know that's the reasons why I refer people to a lawyer all the time. I'm like, I don't know. Common sense doesn't always make sense in the eyes of the law. So are there common mistakes that people make?
I would say first is not consulting with an attorney and not knowing exactly what they're entitled to. It doesn't mean that you have to ask for everything that you are entitled to, or that you have to offer everything that the other person is entitled to. It's just that you have that knowledge base, that you're entering into an agreement with informed consent.
Okay.
The other thing that I would say that most people make mistakes on is, I very much appreciate couples and parents who believe that they're going to be able to co-parent and things are going to go well, and they don't necessarily want specific, pickup times and drop-offs and specifics around their, those types of things in the agreement. However, I always caution, I would prefer people to be more specific in the agreement and have a backup than be vague. And then, if things aren't going well, then they're stuck with no specificity as to what the schedule is supposed to look like.
Okay.
Yeah.
I bet that happens a lot where people are getting along, or they think it's going to look one way, or maybe things change as kids get older. That's certainly something we see. Agreements when the children are little, where they're very amenable to going back and forth. The mom and dad's house, for example, as they become teenagers, they don't want to go, for example, or things get in the way. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my goal with clients is that this document is, in a drawer and they never have to look at it, and they can co-parent, as needed. But we all know life happens, circumstances arise. And so there may be situations where they have to pull it out and rely on it more. So having a specific schedule in the agreement, even if it's a brief, outline as to what days it's going to be, it doesn't have to necessarily say pickup's going to be at 5 o'clock, right? Then you have at least a framework to work with.
Yeah, that sounds really good. That's super helpful. Okay. Can we move on to some financial money sort of related questions? So firstly, are there any financial aspects to consider about when to actually file for divorce or get separated? So I'm thinking about like taxes are due, or you just paid the taxes, or you're applying for college and you're filling out a FAFSA form, or maybe your company is getting ready to be sold. How does that play into people's like when to actually do this?
Yeah. So obviously it's very fact specific, but based on someone's specific situation, and that's going to vary. And my CYA is I'm not a tax attorney or a CPA, so you should consult with your own. But that being said, one thing that we commonly see is a question of when to file around the end of the year, right? So if we're talking about people who are finalizing their agreement in like October, November timeframe, then I do have a frank conversation with our couples. Does it make sense to file and have your divorce hearing before the end of the tax year? Because if you're divorced before December 31st, then you're going to have to file separately for taxes.
I see.
Or should they file in December and ask for their hearing to be in January, so that their divorce is finalized in January? They get to file the joint taxes for that particular tax year, and then they're divorced the following year. That's a common thing that we run into. Another piece that I see very commonly is one spouse is covering the other and the family on health insurance. Yes. And this is going to be one of the biggest expenses, right? And it could be that the second spouse either isn't eligible for health insurance because maybe they're self-employed, which is very common, or they just don't work, they work part-time and they don't have benefits available to them through their employer. So then it's a question for couples, is there a rush to get divorced, right? You have a contract, it resolves all of your, all of the specifics. The only thing that the divorce is going to allow for either spouse is honestly to get remarried. And so unless there's a real push for that finalization, couples may choose to legally be married, live under the terms of the separation agreement, simply to keep the spouse on health insurance.
Okay, that's really great. I hadn't even thought about the health insurance thing, although it certainly does come up and is a huge expense for people in their monthly outgoings.
Yes.
You brought up a point, and I'm just not clear on the law. So if someone is legally separated, they're going through this process, they are legally or allowed to date? Like, because I've definitely had people ask me like, oh, am I cheating? How's that gonna what's the law say about that? Does the law say anything about
Oh,
it?
we're all over the place.
Oh,
So Maryland technically still has adultery as a crime on the books.
okay.
That being said, it doesn't get prosecuted. And I think the fine is $10. The other piece of legislation that is going to go into effect in October is Maryland is also getting rid of all of our fault grounds for divorce. So you're not even going to be able to get a divorce granted on the basis of adultery starting October 1st. So, and practically, as it stands with the current law in place, very rarely does adultery become a factor. It is one of the factors, 11 factors a court can consider when making a determination of property division or alimony. But honestly, most judges don't weigh it very highly. So the true impact of adultery or relationships while technically married doesn't come into play very often.
Okay, that's very helpful. I
Yeah.
assumed that was the case, but I've definitely had clients ask me or
Mhm.
be concerned about that, and that makes sense. But certainly people are dating and
Yeah.
wanting to explore other relationships. That's helpful.
Right.
So
And I would say, I would just say that, especially if the agreement's already done,
yeah.
then it really doesn't make a difference. It can impact how the negotiations of the agreement go. And so sometimes the adultery can be leverage from one side or the other when negotiating the agreement.
Interesting. Oh, there's a lot. There's a lot there. But this is why we have people like you to help us navigate all of that. What about alimony? So people are always asking me, will I get alimony? Or I hear a lot like, uh, usually it's my spouse makes more money than me, or they say a lot. And I don't know if that's 10,000 or 100,000, like what that, but I know that alimony is not allocated to everybody. So how does one decide that? Or how does the court decide that? Or
Yeah. So this is a challenging concept in Maryland as well, because we do not have specific guidelines that a court has to follow.
okay.
It is 100% subjective based on the judge that hears the case and how they want to weigh the 11 factors they have to consider. So the example I commonly give, I'm primarily in Howard County. We have 5 judges here. They can hear the exact same case and fact pattern, and all 5 judges will come up with a different solution to what it's going to look like, which is another reason for people to really settle this outside of court, because you never know what you're going to get.
Okay.
The factors that come into play, the biggest factors, are how long have the parties been married? What are the needs of the party requesting support? Like how much of a deficit are they at each month?
Mhm.
What is the ability to pay of the potentially paying spouse? After they have paid all of their reasonable expenses, how much overflow do they have, disposable income left over? And can they meet any of that gap? At the basis, those are the core things that we're looking at. The other thing is, potentially whether or not child support's being paid. One factor that kind of came in and is now not as much of an issue is alimony is no longer tax includable to the receiving spouse or tax deductible to the paying spouse.
Huh.
So this happened in 2018, 2019. So sometimes there was kind of a way to approach the negotiation to show that it was going to be beneficial to the paying spouse because it was going to be a tax deduction. And so we could kind of negotiate how the support was going to be paid to help that. Now what we see a lot more of is honestly alimony payouts, so let's take an example. If the agreement was that someone was going to get $1,000 a month for 3 years, basically $36,000, there might be an exchange of property for that, right? Or some sort of negotiation of the equity in the house or something along those lines. I would say that's what we see more of these days. But there are, We have guidelines internally that we can kind of use as a benchmark,
Yeah.
but there's not like a hard and fast rule.
Okay. That's helpful. So I guess what I hear is you get for what you ask, and if you don't ask, you won't get. So right. So nobody's gonna say, hey, let me pay you some alimony. But if your lawyer advised you, you can certainly ask for it
Right.
and see what happens.
Yeah.
Okay. What about the division of assets? The big question.
Mhm.
So when I think about assets, I think about like the concrete things that you have, like $20,000 in your bank account. And then those more fluid things like the value of your house today, but what will it be in 10 years? And then what about like business, like you mentioned, like if you own a business that maybe gets valued or some kind of a retirement investment, like
Mhm.
who decides who gets what?
Yeah. So with our clients, they are deciding what that looks like, right? And what we help them kind of think through is on each of those pieces, what makes sense for them. So, commonly, let's take the house. That's a very big question for most people, especially with the rates where they are. Um, what we help them work through is, okay, well, how are we going to determine what the fair market value is? What does that look like? Some people will choose, just say, we both agree the house is worth 500,000 because they know what the other houses in the neighborhood are going for. Sometimes they will use an appraiser that they independently hire to give them a value. Sometimes it will be, okay, well, one spouse is going to stay in the house and buy out the other person's interest. So we're going to use the appraisal connected with the refinance. So we help them kind of identify what is the process for determining this.
Right.
And then we set up the formula. So usually it's the fair market value, subtracting out how much they owe on the house, deciding whether or not they're going to subtract closing costs, from that formula, and then figuring out how it's going to be divided. Most of the time, not always, but most of the time it's divided by 2 because the whole thing is marital and they're going to split the proceeds. But there can be reasons why they choose to do something different than that.
Okay, very interesting. So there's the house, but what about like retirement? So say for
Mhm.
example, you have a stay-at-home mom and the husband's working and putting money into some kind of retirement fund and she isn't working because she's raising the kids.
Yep.
Is she entitled to say, for example, like a retirement fund?
Mhm. So the general law in Maryland is that assets that were acquired during the marriage,
Mhm.
regardless of how they are titled, so it doesn't matter if they're in wife's name, husband's name, or in joint names, if it was earned during the marriage, it is considered to be a marital asset. So if in this scenario, the example you just gave, if husband has been saving retirement, putting money in his retirement during the marriage, let's say it's 500,000, and wife did not, then in that scenario, wife could ask for $250,000 from the retirement. And there's a process for how that gets transferred to her.
Okay. What about along that same line? One of my clients asked me specifically this question about like a collection that they have acquired. They've been married a long time, I think several decades in this case. I don't know the specifics of the collection, but perhaps it's artwork or old antique coins. I don't know.
Yeah.
How is that valued? How is that accounted for if it's worth some decent money?
Right. Honestly, the easiest way to deal with things of that nature would be to hire a personal property appraiser, someone who appraises that type of item, whether it's artwork or specific collectibles or something along those lines, and getting an appraised value. Unless there's some easy, objective way of finding out that value in another source. Um, for like cars, a lot of times we'll look at the KBB value.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's a little bit more challenging if we're dealing with a boat, for instance. So anywhere you can find a third party evaluation of an item is probably the quote unquote fairest way to determine that.
What if, for example, the same thing was somebody is married and they acquire some valuable collection from their great grandmother who died and it's some kind of antique. It came down your family line to
Mhm.
me. Is it mine or is it still acquired under the marriage, because we're married when I get this inheritance, for example?
So one of the exceptions to the marital property definition is inheritance.
Okay.
So if you receive inheritance from a family member or otherwise, as long as it was given to someone as an individual, if it's a collectible, that's a little easier, right? Because that can't be commingled with other things. Where it gets complicated is if you are left $50,000 from that great grandfather and you put that $50,000 into the joint checking account, now that $50,000 is a marital asset.
Interesting.
Whereas if you had put that $50,000 in a separate account that you didn't deposit any other assets into, then it's a non-marital account.
Interesting. Okay, very good. So much to think about. I can understand why people get so overwhelmed by this process, but you're really making it sound like simplified. So I appreciate that, or at least it sounds like you know what you're talking about, which I know you do, but that puts people at ease because it's
Right.
very overwhelming if you're not in this world to understand
Absolutely.
all this
Yep.
stuff. What about, so next question, child
Mhm.
support. How on earth does that get calculated? And what if it's not enough? Can I ask for more?
Mhm. So the good thing is child support does follow a guideline in Maryland.
Okay.
So there is a calculator out there. And basically what we do is we plug in the numbers. Now, sometimes it's a question of what numbers to plug in, depending on the specifics of someone's situation. But the formula basically is based on the gross income for each parent, the gross monthly income from each parent, the amount of parenting time each parent has with the children is going to play a factor in the child support. Another big thing that plays a factor is whether or not a parent is paying for the children's share of the health insurance. So
Mhm.
they get a deduction for what they're paying for the kids. And other things that we commonly see is possibly childcare expenses.
Mhm.
They may or may not be in the guidelines depending on what the couple needs. Um, those are the big ones. Those are the big ones.
Okay, very good. That's super helpful. What about if I suspect that my spouse has a bank account or something going on and just doesn't I'm finally looking at our finances for the first time. I thought we made X amount and we should have X
Mhm.
amount and something seems amiss. Are there resources? Are there what do I do basically in that situation where something just seems like maybe is hidden?
This is always a really complicated one because if they're hiding it well enough, then it's hard to track.
Yeah.
If they are not hiding it well enough, then you can track it, but it's going to be expensive, potentially going to be expensive to track it because you may need to hire like a forensic accountant or spend a lot of time digging through old bank account records, credit card statements, and that sort of thing.
Okay.
So, but what I have seen is if someone is in fact what the court calls dissipating assets, hiding assets or hiding money, then what the court has the authority to do is add that back into the pot of marital assets before they divide it.
Okay.
So, for instance, if you can prove to the court that spouse has siphoned off $100,000 that's unaccounted for, right? Then the court can say, well, instead of your $200,000 being split, now we're going to split 300,000, right? And so spouse is going to have to figure out how to fund that additional $50,000 from some source.
Okay. I've heard, and I don't remember if it was in a discussion you and I had at some point or somewhere else, that if a spouse spends significant money on an affair partner, is
Mm-hmm.
that something that can also sort of on that same line of thought? Okay.
Yeah, so that can also be a dissipation claim. We see it sometimes if the spouse has bought extravagant jewelry or taken them on trips or maybe paid for housing, those types of things. that's where that might come into play.
But it's up to you, the person who's claiming this, to prove it to the court that.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's where the time and energy and money comes in.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. What about my last financial question is, what if finances change in some way? Somebody gets an amazing promotion and everything was agreed around them making $100,000, making 150, or the flip side, they get demoted at work, or they go from full-time to part-time by choice or not by choice. Like, what if there's significant changes to income? What happens then?
Yep. So there's kind of two aspects to that. If you have child support that is based on those various incomes, then child support is always modifiable. So basically, if circumstances change, one or the other spouse may ask that the child support be recalculated to account for the change in circumstances.
Okay.
Additionally, on the alimony side, that it could be one of two things. Many agreements are based on alimony that is not modifiable, meaning spouse A agrees to pay spouse B $1,000 a month for 3 years, and no matter what happens, that's not going to change. Only times that would change is if it would terminate if spouse gets married, receiving spouse gets married, or either spouse passes away.
Okay.
That being said, there are some circumstances where parties may agree for the amount to be modifiable. And so that's something to really talk to your attorney about to see what makes sense.
And if say the separation agreement's written, they're living separate, and this is 2 years down the line, they would call you back as their mediator and say, "Hey, Carrie, we need another session or two to work this out," and that's how they would go about.
Yeah, if they've done mediation, that's commonly what happens. Most people will agree that if they have any disputes, in the future, that they would go to mediation to try to resolve it first before going to court.
Okay. And then just on that last question in finances, then for me is like, and this may be an impossible question, how much does divorce cost? Like, I get that the mediation has some like tighter deadlines or some known costs, I guess, compared to like litigation, which is, I guess, by the hour or something. I don't know if that's even accurate.
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. So the biggest difference from us as opposed to a lot of other firms is that we generally charge flat fees for our services. So clients know before they get started, kind of what they're looking at as far as expenses are concerned.
Okay.
I personally think that's the way that it should be, because I think there's a bit of a conflict of interest when attorneys charge hourly, because they have an incentive to make it more complicated and drag it out unnecessarily. But
good point. Very good point.
Which is something that we see on the litigation side. So broad strokes, for those people who are resolving their divorce outside of court, you're looking at $10,000 or less most commonly.
Okay.
Those people who are going to litigation and are spending, more than a couple of months in litigation before they resolve it, you're probably looking at easily 10, if not 40 to $50,000. Those people who go to trial, you're looking at even more than that.
Wow. And when you say $10,000 for mediation, are you like, am I thinking like, okay, I'm paying $5,000 and my spouse is paying $5,000 more or less, or $10,000 sort of each party?
No, usually it's split between them.
That's very different than I think at least what a lot of us have in our mind when we think about the traditional 1980s style divorce.
Right.
Like, where there's months and months in litigation. Okay, that's very helpful. So let's talk about kids for a minute. We'll just start with a question that, again, I feel like all my questions are impossible to answer, but do courts favor moms? Like, do courts, like, how does that work here in Maryland, or specific by county or judge? I work mostly with mothers, so this is a question that they have, frequently.
So I think it can vary by judge or jurisdiction. For most of the counties that we have ever litigated in, I would say that honestly, the most common scenario is that courts generally are going more to a shared access parenting time. where it's not necessarily equal, but it's closer to equal than the older traditional every other weekend dad.
Yeah.
I would say that it's probably very rare now for that to be the schedule, unless there are significant reasons, adversarial reasons why a parent should have, some adversarial impact it's having on the kids.
So that's another question I had. Are there certain behaviors or actions that one might be involved, or something that somebody might be involved in or do that would limit their access to their child? I mean, of course, I'm thinking like if they're imprisoned or if they're in a drug treatment program, but I don't know, like, is there what might lead someone to being separated from the child or not having that more 50-50 style arrangement?
Yep. So the things that I see the most often, and I also represent kids who are in, like, whose parents are disputing custody. So I get appointed sometimes by the court to represent the kids in those issues. And the things that I'm looking for when kind of making a recommendation to the court are the parents, are they wanting to be with the child because they want to be with the child, and because they're trying to impact child support? That's one big one, which is something that we unfortunately see often. It's not as prevalent as it used to be because the changes in the child support, but that is something that comes into play. Also, whether or not that parent is truly involved. And that could be, not necessarily. It could be things like, are they doing doctor's appointments? Are they reaching out to the teachers? Are they being active and taking an active role in the kid's life? Now, just because someone has previously not been active while being in an intact family doesn't necessarily preclude them from being active when they're no longer in an intact family, right? Because naturally roles are going to evolve, and just because they haven't been active doesn't mean that they won't be.
That's right.
So those are the types of things that I'm looking at. Honestly, another biggest one that we probably come into contact with is mental health issues. Is a parent taking responsibility for what, how they are impacting the relationship between them and the child?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that's one I hadn't even thought to jot down, but it comes up is, will the court have access to my mental health? Do they know I'm seeing you? What if they ask for my records? If my husband knows I'm in counseling, they're going to use that against me. Is there anything you can say to that are those well-founded fears? Or, I mean, I understand that to be protected health information, but what do you think?
Yep. So from an advocate from behalf of the children, I honestly am looking for parents who have been enrolled. I appreciate the parents who have taken the initiative to get therapy. And I'm honestly more skewed, if you don't, then that's a bigger red flag for me. So, obviously, I think it's, subjective based on who you have, but I think that's probably the more commonplace.
Okay, good. What about if there's domestic violence in the home, child abuse or active addiction? Is there, again, I work mostly with women. So is it helpful for them to have like medical records, police records? Like what's helpful or what happens differently in divorce when we have like those really like aggressive, violent or really just hard situations beyond the normal stress of getting divorced?
Yep. I would say the more documentation, the better. And I know that's always difficult, especially in cases where there is domestic violence, because a lot of things that happen behind closed doors. But to the extent that they are able to document it either through medical records or police records or other witnesses, the better. The other basic thing that I would suggest for anyone who's going through, those types of situations is writing things down, as it's occurring. So keeping a calendar, keeping a diary, because that stuff can be used as evidence in the long run. And it's better if you write it down as it's happening, because it shows what you're going through and what's happening in the moment, not a recreation, weeks, months, years later.
Yeah, because our memory is historically, it's very hard to recall things accurately over time, especially in times of distress. So you're saying, though, if a person was to journal, chronologically in real time, that might be used in evidence in court or something like that. Interesting.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What about, like, that kind of leads me to another question. So we know that there are some people who are aggressive, spiteful, vindictive, who they just want to make this difficult. Do you have any advice for, a lot of times I see women staying in marriages because they're afraid of the alternative of sort of thinking that even though it's not good in the home as it is, they anticipate, and obviously often rightfully so, that it will get worse. Do you have any advice for those women or men for this?
Yeah.
It definitely happens both ways.
It does happen both ways. And it is always hard to make the decision to leave. And many people choose not to because they think it's going to be better for the kids. And my concern is it's not healthy for the kids to be in that toxic environment, right? Even if you can hold out, you're still putting your kids in the situation of being in that toxic environment and expecting that to be the way that relationships work. And so setting them up long term. Yeah. It's really getting that support network so that you can make the decision to leave. And what I have heard both from, clients, friends, families, colleagues, is that it's so much harder to make the decision, but once they took the step, things were so much better.
Yeah, I've heard the same exact thing, and I try to reiterate that to people often, that when you're living in the turmoil of a toxic relationship, it's hard to imagine leaving. It's hard to imagine what life would look like in that interim, which of course is often worse than even the bad situation you're in, because things often escalate as you leave or try to leave. But you put yourself forward in 2 years' time,
right,
forevermore. It's you rarely meet a woman who says, "I wish I'd never done that."
Right.
They usually wish they'd done it sooner.
Yep.
Yeah, that's really.
And so it's having that support network. It's setting the boundaries and sticking to them. And as you can't change how the other person's going to react. So it's all a matter of how you interact with them, and how you approach it, and being in a space where you can, deal with that and not react a lot of times is really the key, is not reacting to kind of engage and fuel that behavior.
Yeah. No, this has been really, really helpful. I know there's probably a million more questions I could ask you, and I'll probably stop this recording and think of some, but this is, I think, what I really appreciate is this nice framework we have for people, because I know that when I'm working with a client, they have so many questions and everything seems so foreign and overwhelming. And I really appreciate you kind of bringing like some calm to the storm of, like, don't worry, I've got this. Like, I've seen, right? Like, I'm guessing you've probably seen it all before.
All of it.
All of it and then some. And that, I think people really need us therapists and lawyers and forensic accountants and all the other team members that you're working with to kind of bring that solid ground and, like, to hold their hand, to hold hand and let them sort of fall apart like they need to in this, because it's, divorce is a huge grief process for people, and it's really hard to make good decisions when you're grieving. So I know it means a lot to get along with your lawyer, to trust your lawyer, to know who to call in these situations. So if people do want to reach out to you, Carrie, what's the process like? Like, should they call you, email you? How can they get in contact with you?
Sure. So lots of different ways. They can either go to our website and schedule a consultation through the website if they want to directly, and it's jacobsonfamilylaw.com.
Okay.
They can call us, and our intake individual can walk them through scheduling, and that is 443-741-1147.
Okay.
We also have other educational videos and information resources out there. We are on, I feel like, almost all of the social media channels. We have a Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube channel. So
Yeah, and your videos are great. I like that they're short and to the point, which is like in a busy day, in a busy world, short and to the point. Like, I really appreciate that, taking in tiny bits of information in little spaces and then
yep.
digesting that and then coming back to something later. So I really appreciate that. Well, thank you. Is there anything that you think I didn't ask you that you're like, oh, but I really want them to know X, Y, and Z? Or do you think, I mean, I feel like we covered a lot, but
I feel like we covered a lot. I'm sure that there are things that, people experience and may have questions about, but, happy to dive into those if they have specific questions in consultation. The one thing I would say is that if people are interested in doing mediation, our consultations usually are with both individuals in the couple. So we do a joint mediation consultation to kind of walk through what it looks like and what the process is. And then I would say that the other big difference between us and a lot of other mediation practices is that we also can file the divorce paperwork for parties if they want us to handle it from start to finish.
Right, because I guess the mediators can be used in lots of situations, like with a business partner or
Right.
a husband and wife who are just disagreeing on some
Yep.
aspect of it. Yeah, gotcha. Okay, that's super helpful. And you said, although you're in Columbia, everything's virtual, but you work all over Maryland and the DMV, so that doesn't
Yes.
preclude you from working with certain clients that would see this video that I work with. Okay. That's very helpful. Well, I really appreciate you taking an hour out of your day in the middle of summer, to do this. And I know you and I have gone back and forth about trying to find a time. And yeah, it's just the way life works. I think, people can relate, we can relate to our clients as working
Yep.
women and having children and all the things. So I really do appreciate you doing that for me. So thank you so much. And I'm just gonna go ahead and stop the recording, and thank you so much.
Thank you.